Two men who know the angles, uncover and untangle all the questions and the webs left out to tangle. Be in 1962, last Wednesday's afternoon, they'll bend your ears with reckless self-abandon. The amazing Spider-Talk, the amazing Spider-Talk. Come swing through the air, sit back and prepare for the amazing Spider-Talk.
Hello, I'm Dapper Dan Gvozden, and I'm the founder and editor of the AmazingSpiderTalk.com.
And I'm mischievous Mark Ginocchio, founder of the Chasing Amazing blog and author of 100 Things Spider-Man Fans Should Know and Do Before They Die.
Well, thanks for joining us, everyone, for episode 6 of the second season of the all-new Amazing Spider Talk. We hope you enjoy this podcast and that it provides an intelligent conversation between two fans and collectors as we look at the Spider-Man comic universe in a bit of a bigger picture.
Yeah, Dan. So after kind of doing something a little different last time out, here in that episode 6 of the second season, we're continuing with our journey through Spider-Man hitting the big time during the Stan Lee and John Romita Sr. run on Amazing Spider-Man. In that case, we're talking about the first ever 8-part. Well, I mean, it's just the first ever multi-part, like more than 3 or 4 issues, but 8-part, I guess, you know, I guess that still counts as a first ever, right?
Go collect this one. That's what we're saying. It's definitely sure to bounce up as high as Amazing Spider-Man 263 did this week.
Yeah, oh, goodness. I don't even want to get into that right now. Well, anyway, this story dips into some social commentary and really expands the supporting cast and the Rogues Gallery. Yeah, we're talking about Amazing Spider-Man number 68 to 75, also known as the Lifeline Tablet Saga or the Stone Tablet Saga. I mean, pick your title, Dan. I mean, it's a tablet and it's a saga, okay?
I'll take that at the very least. Well, right. Like many of the issues that we've been talking about this season, Amazing Spider-Man numbers 68 to 75, the Stone or Lifeline Tablet Saga, say that 10 times fast, can be found in your local comic shops or Marvel Unlimited, the local library, or on Comixology. Basically, pretty much anywhere you can find comics, you can find these issues. But they were also released just last year as part of a collection called the Lifeline Tablet Saga, which I think is where that name came from, because I think everybody else just referred to it as the Stone Tablet Saga up until now.
Yeah, but apparently in that collection there's like a mini series from 1999 referring to the Lifeline Tablet, which that's totally off my radar. Do you know this series, Dan?
I do not, so I'm gonna have to check that out, and you can check it out too. You know, go to your comic book shop and ask them if they carry this book, the Lifeline Tablet Saga, or you could probably just order it online. So if you want to read just these issues, that's an easy way to do so. So whether you've read these stories a million times or not at all, we hope you enjoy our episode entitled The Stone Tablet Saga. Or is it the Lifeline Tablet Saga? I'm not even sure.
The Toltecs give me the invulnerability that will carry me into the next millennia.
Father! Are you all right?
Better than all right. I feel wonderful.
Dr. Connors, where are you? No. I don't want to be like this! Make it stop. Please, somebody help me!
All right. right, Dan. So we're talking about Amazing Spider-Man numbers 68 through 75 here. 8 whole, big smacking, beautiful Stan Lee, John Romita Sr. issues here. And you know, it's funny, Dan, we've been doing this new format, all new Amazing Spider Talk for a season and a half now. And we really haven't, in any of the prior episodes, talked just specifically about one storyline. That was something we did with frequency, obviously, and during our old format, especially during the Essential episodes. So I guess, you know, just to peer back the curtain a little bit here, in terms of why we chose to talk about the Lifeline tablet. I mean, besides the fact that I kind of bullied you into doing this episode, I feel.
It's the best kind of bullying. It's like, hey, you're going to eat this ice cream right now.
I want to talk about this, Dan. Let me talk about it, please. But no, Dan, I mean, and I think I kind of won you over to my side. Not that you were fighting it all that much, but you know, I found this storyline to be pretty significant from a, you know, Spider-Man historian standpoint, because, you know, especially when I was going back and doing the research for you know, my book a couple years ago. You know, it's kind of funny, the whole long form storytelling. I mean, comics, you know, written for the trade these days, and you know, that's kind of standard operating procedure. But this is an instance where this is really Spider-Man's first foray into long form storytelling, and even like looking at like Marvel's contemporaries. I don't, you know, the only other one that's like kind of comes close in terms of being so large in scope and with characters and things going on was probably the Kree-Skrull War in Avengers, and that came about a year and a half after the Stone Tablet Saga. And Kree-Skrull War is considered like one of the most landmark storylines in all of Marvel history. So because of what it kind of implemented and, you know, in terms of how it told a story. So, you know, obviously I don't think this one is on par with that, but it's kind of gets the template going, I would say. And then beyond just the length of it, Dan, I mean, this storyline has a lot of kind of real world social issue implications that Spider-Man comics and comics in general just weren't delving into at this point until now. Looking very strictly at a Spider-Man micro level, this kind of really sells the idea of the street level universe that we talked at length about in the first season, with characters like the Crime Master and the Enforcers and thing. I mean, I feel this kind of takes that idea and does it one better, because these characters are a little less hokey and you know, kind of silly. I mean, you know, the street level characters during the Lee Romita run are a little more, you know, kind of, there's a realistic criminality to them, if you know what I mean.
It's funny that you say that, because one of the reasons I push back on, you know, talking about this on the show is because this arc, you could look at it kind of, I don't think each issue stands on its own. There are some that are more standalone than others. When we start getting into the kind of villain of the month, kind of middle chapters of this book. But when I think about this story, I always think about the end of it, where it's kind of goofy and I mean, in a good way, and kind of fantastical. And I forget about the street element of it that so dominates the first half. And the kind of tablet, you know, that eventually would go on to be so fantastical is really downplayed for so much of the story that you can almost forget that it's a long-form story arc that's occurring. And so I had kind of forgotten about how landmark that was. It's a quietly doing it, and in an era where comic books are so loud these days about what they're doing and how spectacular they are, this was really refreshing to read, and I upon reading it immediately was like, Mark was absolutely right to want this one to be included in, you know, our precious 12-episode format.
Fair enough. Well, you know, we'll have to save that soundbite. Mark was right. You know, just take that Come on, fans. I need you. I need some audio engineers out there to take that bite and send it and put it on the internet, put it on Twitter. Let's make it happen.
You'll be lucky if I include it in the episode.
Yeah. Oh.
This is a private conversation occurring right here.
Oh, boo, boo, boo. But anyway, I thought, like, since we're talking about three kind of main points to why we wanted to include this, I thought we'd kind of elaborate on each one in here. So let's start talking a little bit more detail about the form of this storyline in terms of the length and this whole thing of a multi-part saga. I mean, again, like, I feel like we take this for granted today. I mean, it seems like every single comic book storyline is written with six issues minimum, right? I mean, like, it's like, how many trades can we get out of a storyline? And obviously, a trade paperback was not, was barely a figment in the imaginations of the big two publishers back in the late 60s when this storyline came out. The fact that we had seen like some 3-part stories, like the Master Planner story, or even some 4-part stories like the Doc Ock Spider-Man Amnesia storyline that had come about a dozen issues before this one came out. But this is, to do something like, I mean, essentially over 3/4 of a calendar year, which is what this was very ambitious for the time.
And you could only do this if Spider-Man was popular, right? Like, this is truly a reflection of how much Spider-Man, as we like to say, hit the big time during this run, because you're relying on there being enough of a comics culture and interest in this character that people seek him out every month instead of just randomly picking up an issue on a spinner rack. Like, right. This, in a way, sort of reflects this slowly being born collector's mentality that, would start to take over the entire Marvel line, where everybody had to tune in for everything. And so when some of these, we'll talk about, like, side characters show up from other books, like, it is truly a reflection of how much steam Marvel was gaining at the time.
Absolutely. I mean, as the old Stanley adage, every comic is somebody's first comic. I mean, that was something that they kind of held dear, especially during this era. They didn't want someone to just pick something up and not know what was going on. And to that point, I feel that this storyline it kind of skirts around that issue pretty flawlessly in my mind. I mean, the common thread to all these stories is the existence of this MacGuffin of sorts, the stone tablet. I mean, we don't even really know what it does until the very, very end of the storyline. But all we know is it's something. It's expensive. It's ancient. It's valuable. People want it, and the people who want it are the bad guys. You know what I mean? Like, so, without having to get into too much mythology of what the tablet is, it's just it's a premise that can be kind of sold at the beginning of each issue, whether it's Kingpin or Shocker or Quicksilver or Silvermane and the Magia. It's just, oh, these people are after the tablet now, and that's kind of the thread that connects all these issues. You don't necessarily have to have read every single one to just pick up a comic here and know what's going on.
Absolutely. So let's talk about the kind of, I guess, 3 stages of the story and kind of give an idea, if you haven't read this story, what exactly is it about and what makes it special?
The first part, the first couple issues, it deals with Kingpin trying to get the tablet, and the tablet being at Empire State University, which is where we start also getting into some of the social issues. But there's protesting on the campus, and Kingpin uses that as an opportunity to steal the tablet. At this point, Kingpin is really kind of establishing himself as, certainly during the Romita run, as Spider-Man's main rogue. I mean, Goblin has kind of been taken out of the equation. I mean, we just kind of wrapped up a big Doc Ock story, and he wouldn't be coming back for a while. The fact that, Kingpin is the guy here, that's significant. And we're also getting like a peek into Kingpin's like expanded universe, which I think Romita would get into later on, not during this arc, but later on in his run. I mean, we are under the impression that there's a wife that's scary. Do you like that throughout this, where it's like, oh, but you're afraid of your wife, right, Wilson?
Yeah, she kind of makes an appearance. Like, she's like a shadowy figure in a car later on.
Right. And then the second part of this is like these like kind of like series of standalone issues, right? Which is kind of cool.
It's cool. It's the least effective part to me. I mean, you've got Quicksilver and the Shocker and our favorite man in leather, Man Mountain Marco.
Yes.
Who kind of hangs around for the rest of the story in a way that the Shocker and clearly Quicksilver do not. Right.
And just to make note, Quicksilver is not actually really like the villain of the month per se here. Actually, this was some of Stan Lee's world famous salesmanship here, in that Quicksilver's brought in as a way to tie into the Avengers story, but it feels, I mean, it's clearly like a marketing ploy, but at the same token, it feels a little more organic than, say, like Amazing Spider-Man Annual #1, where like they're just not even being subtle about look, there's Thor flying, go read his book.
The only way that book could be less subtle is if you open the book and it was just a series of ads instead of comics. Like, yeah, and that's essentially what a large part of that is. Yeah, this is harmless, I think, and it works because there's an idea. The transition into this kind of section of the book is that the Kingpin frames Spider-Man for helping him steal the tablet. So, in order to prove himself worthy of the Avengers, Quicksilver is going to take out Spider-Man and save the city of New York several $1,000s, I guess, cop fees.
Yeah. And like you said, it's Quicksilver's on the outs with the Avengers based on something that happened in that series. So again, it kind of makes sense, and it's a good way to get someone to be like, oh, I guess I have to check out this Avengers book. What's going on with Quicksilver? You know what I mean? And not for nothing, I think it's a pretty cool cover that we get here. I mean, I like how Romita renders Quicksilver throughout this storyline, so it's kind of forgiven.
It's fun. Hey, can I coin a new phrase for this kind of story?
Yeah, what's that?
I'm going to call it the Monthly Misunderstanding.
Oh, it sounds like very sitcomish. I love it.
There we go. For all the issues that are based on a faulty disagreement, I guess.
There you go. It's like the template for a Marvel team up.
Yeah, exactly.
And then the last kind of arc to this arc within an arc is it deals with Silvermane and the Magia, and this is kind of like you said where it gets a little silly because then we kind of learn that this ancient tablet actually is basically has the code for the Fountain of Youth, and then we get like Kurt Connors into this, and he's kind of fighting his lizard instincts again to decode the tablet, and then Silvermane gets a potion from it, becomes young and kind of frightening looking, like almost very it's like a truly Faustian bargain being struck here. And, in that vein, then reverts all the way back into being a baby, which is kind of like, what? Like, what did I just read?
The creepiest thing about it to me, other than the image of, like, the child disappearing into the closet thing, which is terrifying, is, like, that young Silvermane looks like an angry Peter Parker. So you've got this, like, kind of strange moment where Spider-Man is chasing after himself in some sort of way.
oh, sweet youth, how we all look like Peter when we're young.
Oh, John Romita Sr. So, Mark, rereading this for this episode, I mean, I've read this a ton of times, but, it always comes to me fresh every time I read it. I can't tell you, I mentioned it earlier, just how, like, pleasurable it was to read this, because as an 8-issue story, there is kind of something to the looseness of its construction that we don't see very often anymore. Everything kind of, now if it's an 8-parter, it's got to be this momentous occasion where all of the pieces of the clock are working perfectly. I liked how much room to breathe there was in this and spend time with Peter at home. There's a great moment where he just kind of falls asleep exhausted into his pillow. And I thought, man, it's been a long time since I've seen a moment like that in a Spider-Man comic. I gotta say, like, this was really just fun, truly fun to read. How about you? Like, what was your experience reading this through before we get into kind of the details of it?
Oh, no, I agree absolutely. And like you said, I mean, it's kind of refreshing in retrospect, especially when kind of compared to today's storyline. I mean, it's loose, but like at the same token, there's enough of a thread here that ties it all together in a way where it doesn't feel like too aimless, you know? Like I'm not like just like, you know, as I'm reading through this, and granted, you know, I have the power of just binging through these issues thanks to like Marvel Unlimited, but you know, I'm not sitting there thinking to myself, oh man, we're still talking about this tablet. What's going on? You know, like when are we going to move on? Like, whereas, you know, I feel like sometimes today I kind of get tired because I think like there's so much effort in today's stories to, like you say, you know, make sure that every gear is moving in you know, and is synchronized, and like it makes it feel forced instead of like kind of just, I don't know, like, hey, we're gonna do a little Avengers tie-in here while we're also dealing with this Stone Tablet tie-in, you know, like it's kind of like, oh, they're just going with it, but it works. I find it refreshing, and yet, you know, these stories are absolutely all connected together, but they're not so connected that, like, you know, if you missed a chapter, you would be completely like lost. I mean, maybe if you saw like Silvermane becoming a baby at the end, you wouldn't know what that was about. But other than that,
I think the trick to this storyline is that the villain keeps changing. Like the MacGuffin is not terribly interesting, but the villains all are, and their relationship to it and their desires for it. I think so often now that the opposite is done in comics, where the MacGuffin is the key to the story, and the MacGuffin is never as interesting as the motives surrounding it. I think right now, you know, this story to me, in reflected in modern stories, most clearly seems to be the, you know, Chip Zdarsky spectacular run. Seems very much hewn in the cloth of this story, but you know, the villain remains the Tinkerer throughout, and is thus not very interesting. And I think this, you know, feels very much the opposite.
Or even the whole thing with Scorpio in the first, you know, throughout the bulk of Volume 4 for Amazing Spider-Man, and like, you know, it's like Scorpio and the Zodiac Key, and it was kind of like, all right, are we moving on this? Or are we just going to keep banging this drum? You know, like you kind of needed it to get changed up. I mean, by the end of this, Kingpin is, I mean, you know, yeah, they're referring to Kingpin, but I don't even think he shows up through the last 4 or 5 issues of this, right?
Yeah, we just move on to another crime family.
There you go, because, you know, there's plenty of room for multiple crime families. Now, the other thing that I think really kind of sets this story apart is the social aspect of it. I mean, this is, it's funny whenever I think of a Spider-Man comic in protests. I mean, before I think of this storyline, I always think of that scene in Ditko's last issue where, you know, Peter in full Ayn Rand mode goes like, oh, what do they want this time? You know what I mean? And about the protesters, and just the true juxtaposition here where it's like, you know, it's 1969 now. I mean, you know, the United States is you know, a tinderbox waiting to explode in terms of the real world with Vietnam and with race issues. And, you know, yeah, there's still a glossy sheen to the social conflict of this storyline. I don't want to pretend like, you know, that they were really like getting under, you know, into the gritty of some of the issues that were plaguing America. But for superhero comics, this is edgier stuff, I'd say, right?
Yeah, I totally agree. And I actually think it's pretty like even-handed for the most part, at least up until the conclusion of it, where it feels kind of like a false ending. We'll talk about it in a moment, but I like how this is explored through the eyes of Peter Parker. Even his stance is, in a way, kind of respectful to the Ditko issue. He's not totally on board with this kind of social revolution and where it's headed or how it's being enacted. And I think that's really quite interesting. It says a lot about Stan and his politics and, I guess like what kind of figure he would be in terms of pushing social movements ahead. And, he had Stan's soapbox where he would often talk about his, kind of like, he's a pretty liberal guy.
Right.
But here I think he takes a more kind of like cautionary approach, which I find really interesting. Do you want to set up what this argument is about?
Yeah. I just to that point, it's the old Michael Jordan saying, Republicans buy sneakers too, like, it's kind of what I think of when I read this story in retrospect. But yeah, so before I think to set up the setup here, let's I find the central figure here to be Joe Robbie Robertson, who had been introduced about a dozen or so issues earlier by Stan and Romita. He's very significant because he's one of the first African American characters in superhero comics to kind of not be portrayed as a racial stereotype. I mean, and so much so that like until these issues, I don't even think the comics make note of the fact that he's black. He's just kind of in the newsroom as Jonah's right-hand man, and up until this point, the fact that he's an African American is kind of glossed over, which is interesting in its own right, that it took them like almost a year before they finally were like, oh yeah, that's right, we have a black character and there's stuff going on in America in the real world right now that's racially tinged and motivated. Maybe we should make use of that, right?
Yeah, absolutely. But again, like they even acknowledge like the silence about it as like a part of the story.
Yes, well, that's exactly it. So when we're on the campus and the tablet, the MacGuffin is on display at the university, and it's being held in this exhibition hall, and Randy, who's Joe's son, and some of his college friends, although like you get the sense like Randy is kind of rolling with these guys, but I don't know if they're truly friends because they kind of, they're very leery of Randy because the idea is that he's not revolutionary enough, right?
Right, and they even call his father an Uncle Tom, right? Like, do we need to be rolling with this son of an Uncle Tom? Does that make him nephew Tom? I'm not sure.
I don't know.
And the character we're talking about is this character Josh Kittling, who I don't think has ever appeared again in Spider-Man comics after this arc, which is surprising because I think he comes on pretty strong here, right? Like he seems like a pretty strong character. Yeah,
I mean it's again it's one of those funny things, in retrospect when you talk about race issues in comics. Especially Marvel comics, I always feel like people come back to the X-Men because they've always, even though Stan kind of denies it at this point, people were drawing kind of their own conclusions that the X-Men was an allegory for kind of the Martin Luther King versus Malcolm X argument over Black America, whereas one side is we want to be accepted as equals to the whites, and then the Malcolm X, the more revolutionary side, which was no, we're superior to the whites and should be treated accordingly. And not that necessarily that Josh is saying that they are superior, but like this whole idea about Robbie's and I guess by proxy Randy's silence and Uncle Tom-nish, if you will, is the fact that like Randy is kind of Robbie's speaking to this point of no, like I want to use my role as J. Jonah Jameson's right hand man. We can make good in the community. We can do good by being equals with them. And Josh and his friends kind of see it as they're just giving in, they're appeasing, they're not taking a stand for their own, they're not being their own man. And it's, this is a very real racial issue, and I don't think like the language is as charged. Although calling someone an Uncle Tom is pretty charged. I mean, and the fact that that shows up in plain sight, in itself is pretty charged. But like if you go back and like read like Malcolm X's biography, I mean, it's not as charged as like the language he's using about Black America and that. But like we're kind of brushing up against that point, which I think is significant.
And we're talking about an amazing Spider-Man comic.
Exactly.
And to me, this is like one of the reasons I collect this comic or collected this comic, is because it is a nice, time capsule into the past, and what was going on. And this feels very immediate. Like reading this, it's like I wasn't alive then, but it paints a very clear picture. Even if it is watered down for the pages of a comic, and maybe it has a very like white-oriented perspective, but to me it seems very fair and very empathetic towards the questions even the Black community would have with itself over how it needs to handle these issues. The issues here being about a low-rent dorm on campus. But, that whole point aside, it feels so much larger in the way that superhero comics can. They can paint this tapestry that stands in for something far more grand.
Yeah, and just kind of to backtrack a little bit, when I was talking about the X-Men allegory earlier, it's important to note that, in X-Men, the Magneto and they're the Brotherhood of Evil Mutants. They're the bad guys. Here, these kids, no one is portrayed as being bad here. Their point is given agency. It's a valid point. No one is like being like. I mean, yes, Peter is kind of being cautious and non-committal about where he stands on this, but that doesn't necessarily mean that he thinks anyone is wrong.
Well, that's what I like about this. Peter, he's very reluctant to get involved in the protesting because they seem so extreme in their actions. It does eventually escalate to them doing stealing and and scheming to damage property. Not on the level that the Kingpin might.
Right.
But Peter says, my heart is with them, but I need to hear all sides. I need to hear what the dean of the school, who's the opposing force, or the presumed opposing force, has to say. And to me, that, I don't always want to think of Peter as Stan's mouthpiece, right. but I can't help but think that, perhaps that was Stan's political stance at the time, is that, both sides need to be heard in kind of a civil way,
right.
Before we kind of lean into extremism. And, reading this today, I don't want to, get too political on this show, but, I found it really refreshing to kind of read a story about this when so much of our, I guess, everything we, read and are a part of these days seems so extreme.
Right.
So I found that refreshing at the very least.
And then, of course, apropos of nothing, all of this, kind of equivocating from Peter just makes him look like a total wuss in front of Gwen, right?
Yeah, I didn't remember being so much of a firebrand, but here she stands up for herself in front of all these guys in this, this picket, I guess, and is ready to throw down with them. It actually reminds me a lot of Ultimate Gwen, where she pulls a knife on people at the school. I was like, okay, I'm ready for this version of Gwen. I don't think we would ever fully get it, but.
And yet at the same time, she's defending someone who she herself is kind of questioning whether or not he's really worth defending.
Yeah.
It's like you kind of go back to this and you kind of say to yourself, wait, why did she stay with Peter after this? I mean, we know why she stayed. Yes, we know where Peter's coming from. We know that he's truly brave and courageous and has values and ethics. But Gwen doesn't see what we see. It's kind of amazing in retrospect.
Right. Even Peter seems to be a bit miffed about it. He's like, why is anybody spending time with me? I've got so many other things to deal with.
Right. Things here do get resolved fairly neatly. I mean, I'm not trying to be glib, but, the fact that, these kids, these protesters kind of, cause a scene, cause some destruction on the campus, and then of course the tablet gets disappeared because the Kingpin lifts it while everyone is distracted. I mean, like, they're kind of just like being held in a room on campus. Really, it's not even like like no one gets thrown behind bars, which doesn't seem to reflect what reality would dictate would have happened. And right, I mean, like these kids would have been at least in a cell for the night, I would think.
Although I was surprised, again, looking at this through a modern context and through the news we read every day, like, the police pull their guns on these kids.
That's true.
And Peter says, like, this is it's like basically a matchbox waiting to go up. But, typical Peter finding an ability to exploit a potential tragedy by taking photos.
Yeah, good old Peter.
Yeah.
This whole thing over the low rent dorms kind of gets resolved with, like, the dean showing up at the end to be like, I was for the dorms. I just needed the board's approval first. And everyone's like, oh, okay, let's go have a Coke.
First one to the coffee bean.
There you go. And for the most part, these issues kind of disappear over the duration of this arc until you before we started recording, you kind of reminded me of this really interesting scene towards the end.
Yeah, there's this great scene towards the end in the midst of the whole kind of goofiness with the tablet, which we're going to talk about. It kind of feels out of nowhere, but it's a really powerful scene that I think is one for the Spider-Man history books where, Randy confronts his father, Robbie, about how he wants to drop out of school because he just doesn't think that getting a degree and kind of, working in what he calls Whitey's world will really get him far. And Robbie spells out for him again, the value of proving himself within, the already kind of established social, confines and carving out a space for himself there. And then the scene gets complicated because J. Jonah Jameson, storms in after kind of like going into like a brief coma from a heart attack, spurred on by the Spider-Man's threatening him, which is another interesting moment. Anyway, he storms in and basically demands that, Robbie change the headlines and is yelling at him. And Robbie stands up for himself in front of his son, saying, I run the news beat. You can write all the editorials you want about Spider-Man, but so long as I run the news, we're going to present the truth. You can fire me if you want to. And Randy sees this moment and really looks up to his father, seeing that, he isn't just an Uncle Tom. He's standing his ground and willing to take, risk his livelihood for it. And it really gains respect for his father, and he changes his attitude about education. And to me, this moment, Jonah kind of steps back. It's a real defining moment for Robbie and Jonah's relationship and gives you an idea about how Robbie is able to kind of act with integrity even in the position that he's in. And then back to the social, stuff. There's an interesting moment where, even after all this, Randy says, like, how can you keep working for this racist? And J. Jonah Jameson tells him, Robbie tells him that J. Jonah Jameson isn't, in fact, a racist. He just has a real, like, crazy thing about Spider-Man. And that it's important that we don't label him a racist because we need to know who our real enemies are. And to me, I think is a really valuable lesson even today, that we keep an eye on who our real enemies are and not make causes of everything.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a great takeaway. And again, it's kind of to the point of what we've been talking about all this season versus last season. I feel like this is another example of kind of Romita and Stan working together to kind of not necessarily soften the edges, but Jonah under the pencil of Ditko was more one dimensional. Great character, don't get me wrong, but like, he more or less was a villain. He was a villain without a superpower, I feel, in those first 38 issues.
I think Ditko's Jonah would have fired Robbie right then and there.
Yeah. Well, I don't think Ditko's Jonah would have a Robbie working for him.
That's true, too, yeah.
You know, like why would he have anybody that... And I'm not saying because Ditko's Jonah was a racist. I'm just saying that why would Ditko's Jonah have anybody who could potentially disagree with him to the degree that Robbie does? You know, like, question my integrity, you're out, you know? So it's just an interesting kind of, again, display of the evolution. These are always the issues I come back to, the comics I come back to when we get a great Robbie story today, or even those great Robbie stories from like Jerry Conway's second run with Spectacular and Web of Spider-Man, like the Robbie Tombstone stories. You know, it just, you know, without these issues, I don't think you have that depth with that, or the potential for that depth with this character. And Robbie's a great character. I mean, you know, again, for historical context, you had Black Panther, who had just debuted in Fantastic Four like a year or two earlier, and that's it for black characters. Falcon wouldn't come until the end of 1969 when this story was being published in Spider-Man, so like you didn't even have him yet. So Robbie is a true trailblazer and trendsetter. I think I forget that sometimes. I don't know if you forget that, if you forget that, Dan, but like I forget that sometimes just how much of a pioneer Robbie is in terms of comics. Yeah,
and I think he kind of, you know, he has a gravitas still in the comics today. You know, I don't think it's because of maybe his skin color anymore, you know, and the kind of history behind what that meant. But I do think, like, these kind of stories allowed himself to cement himself in the Spider-Man lineup as not just a transient character that we could see every now and again. He's a really mainstay, maybe even more than Jonah now. He seems almost like more of a present character than Jonah in some instances, because he can have that kind of depth. Even if it's just the does he or doesn't he know Peter's, you know, alternate persona.
Yeah. Talking again about the differences between Ditko and Romita. I mean, you know, we had our Romita Rogues episode 2 episodes ago, and, you know, I think we kind of safely came to the conclusion that Romita's contributions to the Rogues Gallery were nowhere near as impressive as Ditko's. And yet, you read a story like this, and, you know, it kind of brings me back. You know, where is Spider-Man most comfortable? Is it fighting the likes of a guy with 4 mechanical arms, or a guy who turns into sand, or who can harness electricity? Or is it fighting like thugs and criminals and mob bosses and characters kind of like what we're dealing with here throughout this Stone Tablet saga? And in its own way, I kind of think this feels more natural to me, Dan, in terms of what Spider-Man, like the kind of stuff Spider-Man really should be doing on a day-to-day basis. I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, at least in this stage of his development, now he feels, you know, like he's like figured out how being Spider-Man works and can handle this kind of larger threat. But there is something really fun about, you know, how he does get to tower over these thugs and kind of use his powers to outsmart them in a way that he kind of has to be even bigger and bolder now with the kind of threats that he fights. And I love all the interweaving narratives of this. It really is a different style of comic, almost like a different genre of comic in these issues. Like the street fighting is one thing, but the kind of writing, this kind of mystery and handoff of this tablet from character to character, we haven't really seen this. I guess Jerry Conway's story a few years back was the closest we've gotten to this kind of a writing.
Yeah, and I'm sure Jerry would probably cite something like this as an inspiration for that. You know, it's funny with Kingpin. You know, Kingpin's really interesting character. We talked about this a bit in the Rogues episode, but you know, something that always strikes me about Romita's Kingpin is that he really doesn't have powers or even like contraptions outside of that cane, which is still kind of weird to me. His laser cane, but at the same token, like you totally buy him as a threat to Spider-Man, a physical threat to Spider-Man, because he's just so physically unique. I mean, he's this big, fat-looking dude, but you know, they really establish every chance possible that he's fast, he's muscular, He's beating up his own henchmen for training. I mean, like this guy is just he's a physical freak. So you can kind of like forgive what would otherwise seem to be a ridiculous appearance and be like, oh no, this guy does pose a threat because he's just so physically different from anything else we've seen in these comics.
And I love how Spider-Man throws it back against him. Like, I'm not one to fat shame, but you can't help but laugh at all of his kind of like fat jokes that he directs at the Kingpin. My favorite one is where he says to him, I thought fat people were supposed to be jolly. They ought to throw you out of the union. Really, really great stuff, which obviously is a precursor to that great scene in Learning Curve from the Ultimate Bendis run. Yeah,
absolutely. And then, like, just in terms of some of the other villains, like the street levelness of them. I mean, like, it's funny. Like, you have Shocker, who, I'm sorry, I still think he should be called Vibrator. It just based on what the character is, but like it does seem to me that Shocker is definitely kind of like, for this story especially, it's like Romita's answer to the problem of a character like Spider-Man fighting someone like Electro or Sandman, because it's like, these are like supernatural style characters, Electro and Sandman, and those kind of villains were more par for the Fantastic Four or the Hulk or somebody like that, not someone with the street tendency. And Shocker kind of like takes those kind of powers, but it just kind of simplifies it by being like, I have an invention and I use this invention and it can cause havoc, but like it's still very kind of simple and refined and not very abstract or like. I don't know. I mean, it's just an interesting kind of inversion on like a more kind of henchman type villain in the Spider-Man universe, right?
Yeah, I love that about the Shocker and the simplicity. He can still vibrate off Spider-Man's blows, but Spider-Man just has to take a gauntlet away from him and he's completely stuck. And
right.
And it's really great. We did get a great message from a listener in regards to our Romita Rogues episodes. A listener from Greece. Do you want to read the message that we got, Mark?
Yeah. Kind of to my point about what the Shocker should be called. Our reader, Kostas Karasikos, and if I said that wrong, I apologize, writes in, Shocker and Vibrator translate both in the Greek word for vibrator. So at one point, a second publisher took a crack at publishing the Amazing Spider-Man comic, and the publisher had this knack to translate everything very literally, including names. So there's actually like a reprint of a Shocker story with a great Mark Bagley cover, where on bright red letters declaring that the Amazing Spider-Man comes face to face with the nasty Vibrator. So there is some fun in translation there. A true Tower of Babel situation here. In Greece, apparently, the Shocker is the Vibrator. So Nick Spencer and Steve Lieber, if you're listening to this episode, you could have had some fun with that in Superior Foes, I think.
There's we don't have to travel far to know that it's not even another universe where the character is named the Vibrator. It literally exists just several thousand miles away from us.
There you go. So I like the use of the Shocker here, and then of course like Silvermane coming in at the end just to kind of show, hey, there's more than one mob boss in this world. I mean, like, it's funny, like during the Ditko run, we had the Green Goblin Crime Master story, and it was kind of like, we're gonna fight to run the mob. Whereas I feel like this one is a little more refined. There's families, and I guess someone was reading his Mario Puzo or something and got some inspiration, right?
Yeah. There's even a character that I forgot about, Caesar Cicero, the kind of crooked lawyer to all these guys, the sort of fixer type.
He's the fixer. Did he fix anything for J. Jonah Jameson or?
That was his third client, was J. Jonah Jameson.
right, that's as political as we get. But yeah, so again, it's not that it's the most significant thing in the world. I mean, as you said at the beginning, Dan, I mean, Spider-Man in street level, it's not the first time, and you know, obviously we've kind of naturally evolved away from it as like Spider-Man has become more comfortable. But I do like how this storyline, you know, kind of moves away from the Ditko villains. You know, we had a run of stories up and through this point where it was a lot of like Vulture and Kraven and Doc Ock, and I feel like in doing Stone Tablet Saga, we really kind of get away with it. Romita kind of has a little more freedom to create a rogue universe, and reading this in retrospect makes me think maybe I was a little too hard on some of his rogues in that one episode. I don't know, maybe or maybe I should have been hard. I don't know. What
are
do
you speaking about Man Mountain Marco? Are you falling in love with his leathery chaps?
All right. Well, Man Mountain Marco's still pretty ridiculous, but
yeah, I agree. I mean, the Shocker is handled here with like real seriousness. You know, like he's a real threat.
Good old Herman Schultz. You know, he's a toughie. Just depends on you know, who's writing him, I guess.
Well, Mark, I thought this was a really great run to read, and I think absolutely, like, it makes me regret not including this in our essentials. Although it's such a long story and such a kind of scattered story, I didn't think about it as one collected thing.
It's all right, Dan. You know, that's why we have the power of the new format. We don't have to talk about essentials anymore. It's all essential.
Of course it is. Of course it is. Well, why don't we take it on out of here, Mark?
Well, sure. Well, thanks for joining us for our 6th episode of our 2nd season of the all-new Amazing Spider Talk. Dan, our next episode will be out in about 2 weeks. And what's going to be the title for that one?
Yeah, Mark, the show is going to be called I'm Spectacular. It's our discussion about the first true and often forgotten Spider-Man spin-off in print, known as the Spectacular Spider-Man magazine. It would serve as the template for so many other Spider-Man titles over the years, and I can't wait to talk about it with you, Mark.
Yeah. Do you have either of these issues in your collection, Dan? Or
You know, I don't, but I think I'm going to probably have to go out and get them.
Also, for our Patreon subscribers, be sure to check out our Patreon page and your podcast feed this week for a special review of Amazing Spider-Man $7.99. Remember, for just $3.99 a month, the price of a new comic, you'll get access to our exclusive new issue reviews, Swarm B-Book reviews, extended interviews, mailbags, and more. And for $10 or more a month, you'll get access to some awesome commissioned artwork. I guess it's pretty official at this point. At some point over the next couple of months, I would say, the next commissioned piece of artwork is going to be coming the way, courtesy of one of my personal favorite artists, the great Alex Saviuk.
And what did Alex Saviuk do in regards to Spider-Man, just for people if they're not familiar with his name?
Absolutely. Well, Alex, appropriately enough, is kind of known for evoking Romita in his artwork. He worked on Web of Spider-Man for a number of years in like late 80s, early 90s. And then he also took over for Romita in penciling the Amazing Spider-Man daily newspaper comic strip. So, I mean, I know you have a personal Alex Saviuk commission. I love him because he did my first ever issue of Amazing Spider-Man that I ever bought off the spinner rack, 296. That was kind of like that transition period before McFarlane came on. And I mean, you know, the guy has just got like a classic Spider-Man aesthetic, very, very Romita-ish, but in his own way, just certainly knew how to draw the ladies. So I think that our piece is going to have some of the ladies involved with it. So, you know, cheesecake, Dan.
Yeah. So like we got Ron Frenz to do Steve Ditko. We're essentially getting Alex Saviuk to give us something Romita inspired to kind of cap out the end of this season.
Yeah, it's going to work out pretty perfectly. I'm very excited by this, and I'm very excited that, you know, after kind of months of negotiating back and forth, we got the green light for something here. So I cannot wait, Dan.
And I'm so excited about it. I'm going to throw in a bonus print as well. That'll be a surprise. I'm not going to tell you what it is, but I'm going to throw in a bonus print. Last time I threw in a Humberto Ramos print. So, for everybody who's a part of our Excelsior Club, get psyched for what we got coming your way.
Oh, man. I don't even know what your bonus print is. That's crazy.
There we go. So, also, everybody, please be sure to check out some of our other shows, like The Ultimate Spin, which is wrapping up the Bendis run with Miles Morales. We got one more issue for that. And what was just recently announced, the end of the Spider-Gwen run from Jason Latour and Robbie Rodriguez. And also, be sure to check out our new podcast, The Untold Talks of Spider-Man, where our co-hosts recently discussed the Marvel Knight Spider-Man run by Mark Millar and Terry Dodson. Plus, we've also got the amazing Spider Slack community for you to join. Just check this episode's description for a link to join our Spider-Man Talkin' community. Mark, you recently kind of jumped into the Spider Slack. Tell us about your experiences there and what people should join up for.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great place for conversation on a whole range of different topics related to comics and comic media and, of course, Spider-Man. And I've enjoyed it. And, I'm not going to lie, Dan, I've kind of enjoyed coming into a couple of discussions and just throwing some bombs in there like, no, this story's terrible. Or, oh, hey, Dan, I'm going to goad you about annuals or whatever, because, that's what I do. I'm a troll, Dan. It's cool, right? I mean, but I'm a lovable troll.
Yeah, I'm not sure if I'm thankful you joined or not, but it certainly made things more colorful. So, yeah, you join us on Spider Slack. It'll be a lot of fun, I guarantee, until we all decide to band together and boot Mark out.
Oh, come on. I haven't done anything that controversial yet.
All right, Mark. Well, where can we find you on the internet for the controversial things you are already doing?
Right. Well, I have been posting on Twitter about comic stuff more, Dan, because, someone told me I need to post more about comics.
I will lower the gun.
But you can find me at Chasing ASM Blog, and of course you can find me on SuperiorSpiderTalk.com, ChasingAmazingBlog.com, and my book 100 Things Spider-Man Fans Should Know and Do Before They Die. Every couple of weeks I get a tweet or a Facebook post from somebody saying, hey, I just got your book. And I'm very excited that the people are still buying the book, still getting the book. I ask you all again, because I hate to be a broken record here, but if you get it and you read it and you love it, or even if you're just okay with it, just put a review up somewhere. It helps the searchability, and it can get the book into more people's hands. Dan, what about you? Where can we find you?
Yeah, of course, you can follow me on Twitter at SupSpiderTalk, where I'm talking about Spider-Man related things, and anytime I do a review over on AmazingSpiderTalk.com, you can go read it there. I was recently invited on another great comic podcast called the Savage Land podcast to kind of talk about modern stories in comics, and even about how we started this podcast, Mark. And that's an awesome comic book show. So I want to point everybody to my episode over on the Savage Land podcast for a lot of additional fun that I've been doing. So yeah, there's plenty to see that I'm doing online. But Mark, we got to wrap this thing up. And one of the most important things about our show is that we fill people with all kinds of inspiration and spirit for everyday life, what they should take with them when they're walking on their street level route, maybe fighting the street level foes as they do. I'm meandering here, but I'm really just trying to get to the point, which is, Mark, you have this phrase you like to say to put hope into the hearts of man. What is that phrase?
I was going to say, Dan, I feel like we're going back to the Uncle Ben story with how meandering you're again. But to cut to the chase, yes, my inspirational quote is, with great podcasts must also come the all-new Amazing Spider Talk.